Summers. I'm the Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at Yale Alumni Association. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you our speaker for today, Jay Winter. He is the Charles J. Still Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. He's a specialist on World War I and its impact on the 20th century. Previously, he taught at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of Warwick, the University of Cambridge, and Columbia University. In 2001, he joined the faculty of Yale, and he is the author or co-author of 25 books, including Socialism and the Challenge of War, Ideas and Politics in Britain from 1912 to 1918, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, The Great War in European Cultural History, The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, René Cassin and the Rights of Man, and most recently, War Beyond Words, Languages of Remembrance from the Great War to the Present. In addition, he has edited or co-edited 30 books and contributed 130 book chapters to edited volumes. Winter is also co-producer, co-writer, and chief historian for the PBS and BBC series, The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, which won an Emmy Award, a Peabody Award, and a Producers Guild of America Award for Best Television Documentary in 1997. He has received honorary doctorates from the University of Graz, University of Leuven, and the University of Paris. Welcome, Jay. I'll turn it over to you and look forward to talking with everyone with questions after the session is over. If you have questions, please do put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and welcome everybody. I want to talk about Primo Levi. He's the author, as I think everyone knows, of a remarkable set of books. Perhaps the most well-known is called in its original, If This Is a Man. Somehow the title got translated to Survival in Auschwitz, which I think is not at all the right translation. I'll call it If This Is a Man, or If This Be a Man, throughout. Now, nobody had a voice quite like his. He wrote with what Joan Scott has termed the authority of direct experience as an inmate in the Monowitz-Buna factory in the Auschwitz complex. He was a witness in a number of ways. First, he both saw and he suffered. He was not an outside observer, but an insider. Secondly, he had the intellectual preparation enabling him to tell the story. He was a chemist trapped in the lager, which he termed a gigantic biological and social experiment. And thirdly, he provided depositions twice, for the Eichmann trial in 1960 and in 1970 for the trial of Friedrich Bosshammer, who directed the Gestapo's anti-Jewish office in Italy. Now, my title is Primo Levi is a Moral Witness, and I want to discuss two other meanings of the term witness outside of the courtroom. The first defines a witness in a religious sense as someone prepared to die for his or her faith. The second is someone who reaffirms the possibility of moral thinking of any kind in the aftermath of catastrophe. My argument today is that Primo Levi was a moral witness in the latter and not in the former sense. Though his Jewishness in the special context of Turin in northern Italy was at the core of his writings and his identity. He was a Jewish witness, I claim, steeped in Jewish culture, but a witness devoid of a belief in God. Now, Primo Levi's stature as a witness to the Shoah has grown over time, and in part the efflorescence of interest in his writing and thinking reflect the way the Shoah and the testimony of those who survived it have framed our understanding of murderous and genocidal projects, both before 1939, say in the case of the Armenian genocide, and after with respect to Cambodia, Rwanda, and the former Yugoslavia. But part of Levi's appeal is a function of his atheism. We live, I believe, in a secular age. The proportion of the population that is church-going has dropped drastically in Western Europe and in North America since the 1960s. There are now more Jewish people, self-identified as Jews, living in the New York metropolitan area than there are living in all of Europe. There has been a fundamental change in the balance, or if you will, the geographical distribution of Jewish life. Here in Paris, the Jewish world before the war and in other parts of Europe has diminished significantly. Now, Primo Levi, I think, speaks for those who cannot say Ani Ma'amin, I believe in God or in the coming of the Messiah, and though he tarries, I still believe. He went through his bar mitzvah and celebrated with his family in their own way, Rosh Hashanah, Purim, and Passover. His Jewishness, though, stopped there, as so many people's Jewishness does today. His was a lighter, more ironic, richly Jewish, though unbelieving, form of Santayana's famous adage, which was meant for Catholics, but can be applied to Jews. What Santayana said was, there is no God, and Mary is his mother. Levi's Jewishness clung to his language, and I believe to his purpose in writing, his moral witnessing. Now, I want you to see the place, the time, and the face of this man, and then talk about his astonishing witnessing. May I have the next slide, please? Primo Levi came from northwest Italy. The city of Turin can be seen as a dot in the yellow field of the Italian Social Republic, the last bastion of fascist rule after Mussolini was overthrown but rescued by German paratroopers and installed in his own republic, the Republic of Salo in 1943-44. It took a long time for American, British, and other troops to move up the boot of Italy and across. And it is that delay which explains how it was that resistance fighting came to northwestern Italy late. Primo Levi's joining the partisans came late. His lack of military training came in the latter months of the war, and so did his betrayal and arrest by Italian fascists. He wound up in Auschwitz because he was a Jew, not because he was a partisan, but he was arrested because he was a partisan, not because he was a Jew. Let's take a look at this man. First of all, the next slide, at age 18, he was actually a war baby. He was born in July 1919, conceived in the last months of the First World War. Next slide, please. We can see his face later in his life. This is in 1980, when he's age 61 and not well, but I prefer the following image, one I'd like to keep on the screen for a while, because it captures his astonishing smile. Next slide, please. This is the man whom I met once and whose writings have haunted me my whole life, and I think I'm in very good company in that. Part of the reason to give this talk is to explain why I find the presence of this one man so important and so moving, almost as if he has graced the moral universe in which we live. Now, what does it mean to claim that Primo Levi was a moral witness? Now, not all witnesses to crimes against humanity are moral witnesses. They are storytellers of a special kind, individuals with a terrible tale to tell, people whose very life is defined by that story. What sets aside the narrative moral witnesses have to tell is that it is based on the individual's direct and personal experience of what Immanuel Kant called radical evil. The distinguished Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit has investigated the philosophical claims of moral witnesses, and argues that such people are carriers of our collective memory of evil and of those destroyed and disfigured by it. Witnesses have special standing as spokesmen for the injured and the dead, and in particular for those who suffer through war, political repression, and racial persecution. Moral witnesses testify at trials, as I said, Primo Levi did. And to be sure, trials are theaters of memory, places where memory is performed. But moral witnesses speak out in many other ways. They write memoirs, they give interviews, they present evidence to the reading or viewing public, and some become public figures. Alongside Primo Levi, Rigoberto Menchú and Elie Wiesel, both Nobel Prize winners, come to mind in this context. There are others you can think of, I'm sure. The moral witness carries a particular kind of memory and makes special claims to our attention. He or she is an iconic figure in the contemporary memory boom and offer ways of perhaps reaching our unquenchable thirst for testimony about the upheavals of our time, perhaps in the way that Nelson Mandela did. Today, I want to address some of the strengths and some of the difficulties, some of the personal difficulties and philosophical ones that are embedded in Primo Levi's position as a moral witness. It is not an easy fate to bear. My argument is that moral witnesses have a story to tell, but it is frequently one that is constructed as against the grain of silence or of conventional wisdom. Moral witnesses speak against immoral witnesses. Therein lies one of the sources of the anger of the witness, and Primo Levi was an angry man. In the aftermath of the Second World War, narratives of heroism and tales of resistance, true enough, helped democratic regimes and some communist ones too to rebuild their political cultures that had been totally compromised or fractured through occupation and collaboration during the Second World War. In this aftermath period of 20 years, from 1945 to 65, maybe even a little later, there was very little room in this political and social process of regeneration of normalcy for the voice of those trapped in the univers concentrationnaire. As the French politician and writer Simone Weil put it, Buchenwald, where political prisoners were sent, included Auschwitz, where racial enemies of the regime, mostly Jews, were sent. Now, a moral witness, like all witnesses, needs an audience to hear the tale. And that audience wasn't there at the end of the war. It emerged at least a decade, and in some places, several decades after 1945. It should cause us little surprise, therefore, to learn that when If This Be a Man appeared in 1947, it was a complete failure in publishing terms. Only a decade and more afterwards was Einaudi, the publisher who rejected it initially in 1947, prepared to put it into print, this time with publicity written by Italo Calvino, among others. The first response to Levi's voice was that the public turned its back on the tale he had to tell. I shall return to this point in a minute. Levi wrote both about the inhumanity of Auschwitz and the humanity of some of those who survived it. He knew of and celebrated armed resistance to the Nazis and their allies. After all, the reason he was imprisoned in Monowitz was because he had joined the partisans, as I said, whose lack of training made it relatively easy for him and his entire group to be captured. Primo Levi, therefore, was not a pacifist. He was not against war. And my central argument today is that, to a large degree, he told his stories not out of compassion, but out of anger. He liked to recite these lines from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I still recall his wonderful Italian accented voice when he did so. The words go in a way that many of you know. Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns, until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. I pass like night from land to land. I have strange powers of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me, to him my tale I teach. This heart within me burns. Levi knew that it continued to burn long after his story was told. The affective, powerful, passionate, and supremely angry character of Levi's writing has been hidden at times by a focus on his scientific detachment from the scenes he witnessed. He was a man, not a secular saint. I reject the interpretation of the scientific Levi, even though he was a scientist. He was not at all detached from his story or from the lager, but found in a very special kind of irony, a unique language to describe it to the yet unknowing world. In his preface to If This Be a Man, he characterized it as, I quote, a sinister alarm signal. While still imprisoned, the need to tell the story to an indifferent world seized Levi, quote, as an immediate and violent impulse. Writing it was a voyage towards interior liberation, the shedding of the mental clothes of imprisonment. The chapters are written not in chronological order, but he said in order of urgency. It is in this sense, I believe, that Primo Levi was a moral witness and paid the price for being so, giving angry testimony about an abomination that he believed could very well happen again. In this talk, I will first consider the nature of moral witnessing, as Margalit has constructed it, and the special features of Primo Levi's accusatory poetry and prose. In conclusion, I'll try to draw out some of the difficulties in the claims moral witnesses make and how witnesses of this kind have helped to shape our contemporary memory of what has happened in the course of this century. My underlying point is that moral witnesses pay a price for the witnessing. Memory is not therapeutic. Memory doesn't heal. Margalit's term is an alloy, moral witness. It doesn't have an adjective and a noun. It's a composite noun in which the two parts cannot be separately analyzed. The category he explores includes those who went through their own experience of the combination of evil and the suffering it produces. Witnessing only evil or only suffering is not enough. It is this double burden, what he terms knowledge by acquaintance of suffering, that separates witnesses from the observer or the victim, and which separates him from most of us, not all, but most. It is not only the awfulness of the experience, but the nature of the risk taken by the witness which sets him or her apart. And risk here means not only having been targeted for persecution or injury in the past, but also facing rejection or even danger by the very act of telling the story later on. The third risk is falling apart through this telling of the story. I don't believe Primo Levi fell apart through the telling of the story, but I believe he risked doing so. The purpose, the moral purpose of moral witnesses, ensuring that the story is told and heard, gives the witness a standing utterly different from that of a reporter or from an historian. They, meaning I try to establish facts as an historian, and my position in the story is outside of it. The witness, in contrast, is inside the story, and his very survival is essential in the storytelling he has to do. In Margalit's terms, the moral witness has to live in order to serve. Now, the last thing a moral witness wants to offer is detachment, scientific or otherwise. His storytelling is based on a hope, and a slender one, that in another place and another time, there exists or will exist a moral community that will listen to their testimony. What makes this hope so sober is that it flies in the face of the tendencies for those subjected to radical evil to despair and to conclude that the notion of a moral community is an absurd and mocking illusion. The moral witness says no. Though no religious source is needed for this denial of despair, there are many religious statements which support it. Margalit, in particular, refers to the language of the Mishnah, to the Perkei Avot, the teachings of the fathers on this point, and joining us to act in the following way. This is the phrase from that verse. Where there is no human being, be one. The minimal moral community established by the act of witnessing is one, or rather one person now and the same person later. The first is the current self, close to the events being narrated. The second, one's future self, somehow still retaining a moral outlook. But the teller of the story must have an audience, perhaps, or of uncertain size, and maybe including people with a tendency to be skeptical, like many of you, but made up of people who may come to listen and understand someday. Witnesses, therefore, are guides to an experience most of us, thank God, never have had to face. And as they write or speak about their lives, they establish not only a set of facts, but what it felt like to be marked indelibly by them. Marguerite uses a meteorological metaphor to make his point. To be a truthful chronicler is to be a perfect historical seismograph, to record accurately the vibrations of history. But a seismograph does not tell us what it is like to be in an earthquake. For that, we need a moral witness. Now, witnesses uncover evil, and without them, the perpetrators can bury their crimes along with their victims. It is the very act of speaking which establishes the case against the deniers. But the witness, Marguerite holds, has no political agenda. His voice stands, whether or not something long-lasting, a treaty, a convention, restitution, compensation, or a guilty verdict actually happens. The testimony is what matters, not its instrumental uses. Now, the witness's tale is a first-person account, a personal encounter. The prosecutor, a legislator, a banker, or I accept this entirely, historians create third-person narratives, stories about what happened to others. The political witness may tell it like it was, but the moral witness tells it like it felt. That is, telling what it was like to be subjected to evil. Now, for Avishai Margalit, a great philosopher, moral witnesses are crucial carriers of memory. Through them, we can learn about terrible events in the past, but more importantly, we can learn crucial moral lessons from them. They speak for a group whose ties are with others who passed through the fire. They have what Margalit terms a thick identity based upon thick relations, personal bonds. Thus, they speak for a particular group, and in doing so, they reach out. A moral witness, Margalit says, may well give voice to an ethical community that is endangered by an evil force and provide confirmation of the power of language itself, at times to provide some modicum of peace to survivors. But it cannot ensure that peace, and certainly did not do so in the life of Primo Levi. So far, so good. There are so many echoes of Margalit's moral witness in Primo Levi's writing, and yet to say this is just the beginning of our understanding of his achievement. Levi's account of his time in Monowitz-Buna, the IG Farben factory, which never managed to produce a single ounce of the synthetic rubber it was supposed to produce, is rightly celebrated as a triumph of the human spirit. And yet its very literariness, its discursive power, derives from Levi's mastery of a very special kind of irony, shared by many other writers, in particular, a large number of Jewish writers. Irony, I believe, conveyed astonishingly well the deeply unstable and precarious nature of Levi's memory of the Shoah. A man who spoke of the duty to remember also knew very well that memory is a frail thing, a leaf in the wind, blown this way and that by current circumstances. It is this ironic and occasionally comic element, and I use that word advisedly, I wish to address today, comic in the Aristotelian sense of tragedy just averted. Primo Levi did not see the Shoah as a tragedy, nor was it averted. Instead, it was an all too real offense, an outrage. He spoke of this outrage in a voice that distinguishes between truth as the painstaking conveying of the nature of the offense in which he believed, and truth as understanding the meaning of the event, which in the case of the Shoah remained for him elusive. Consider the word if in the title, if this be a man, destabilizing any easy affirmation we may take from the text. Levi both affirmed the possibility of asking moral questions and the near impossibility of answering some of the hardest ones. His voice once he had returned from the darkness, had within it a paradox which plagued him oppressively from the moment he reached Auschwitz until his suicide in April 1987 in Turin. Time and again, he returned to that darkness to probe what he termed the nature of the offense, and yet consider the impossible position he was in. He believed fervently that to tell the story was essential to breathing life into his own moral compass, but that the sheer weight of the evil disclosed could smash or damage that moral compass. Telling the tale could be so infused with anger as to overwhelm it or to crush the storyteller. Irony was the tool he used to protect himself. Let me try to unpack this dense statement by reference to the poem he wrote after penning the text of this, If This Be a Man. The poem that is the frontispiece of the book was written after the book. He inserted it as a kind of foreword. He began with a question addressed to, you see on the left, in the first section, you who live safe, meaning you've opened the book, you must be living in a safe and a warm house. He asks us, having opened the book, can you say that the broken human beings turned into the walking dead of Auschwitz were in any meaningful sense just like you, human beings? Was the sense that each man and woman is an irreducible integer with an integrity, was that destroyed by Auschwitz? Was their elemental integrity broken in such a way as to make them other than human? Or maybe make us other than human? Did they even lack what Agamben terms bare life? Only if we face this question in its manifold forms and register its ramifications can we go on living as moral beings. But facing it has its risks, serious risks for the person who asks it. Now, Levi moves after the first section, in which he describes in harsh terms, without compromise, those who went through the camps. He then moves to the second section of the poem, which I find even more remarkable, and provides a provocative transition. Meditate that this came about. Notice the word that, not why. The question why may be the hardest one of all. The question that, the how, not the why, is the one that he asks us to pose. Mull over the fact that Auschwitz actually happened, that the Nazi experiment in the infinite degradation of millions of people funneled into the complex of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Monowitz-Buna, did take place. Attend to the terrifying silences built into these facts and consider what they mean to you. And this is what he means by, I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts at home, in the street, going to bed, rising, repeat them to your children. I'll come back to the origin of that phrase in the Shema, the Jewish credo, in a moment. But then comes the third part of this poem, the end of the second section, which I find the hardest part of this book to read. Or may your house fall apart, may illness impede you, may your children turn their faces from you. I think it's important to separate those last three lines from the rest. The first section is a warning about complacence, about blindness, about forgetting. It is hortatory, commanding, aggressive. The first section of Levi's foreword is a poetic pointed finger. You, consider, consider. That I think we can understand. The second part is a reworking of the Jewish credo, the Shema Yisrael, the essential injunction of the Jewish faith, that the phrase, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, must be taught to children, must be carved on Jewish dwellings and Jewish hearts, must be repeated at home in the streets as our first and last thoughts every waking day of our lives. Nothing could be clearer than the borrowing from the Torah that this section entails. It is a statement turned into poetry of belief. And yet I believe it is a belief that Primo Levi did not share. Now consider the end. the wrath of the survivor whose tale is too horrible for those who now live comfortably to face. May whatever shelter you collapse, Levi warns. May you be struck down by a modern plague, and may your children be unable to look you in the face. Thus, the second part of the poem is blatantly drawn, explicitly drawn from Jewish tradition, from the Shema and from the plagues attending the exodus from Egypt. Well, what do we make of this? Every time I read it, it stops me cold. The first element Levi established is that the nature of the offense at the heart of Auschwitz was not universal. Afflictions were different for Jews than for everyone else. Levi and other prisoners looked unlike the other prisoners. They were treated differently, and they were all sentenced to death with a temporary pause in their sentence. Thus, the story he tells is a Jewish story. But, and here is my second argument, it was a story that Primo Levi told in a language which subverted Jewish tradition and Jewish belief. Now, Levi poses moral questions, and then, disturbingly, to me, subverts our sense that there is an answer to them, and that whatever the answer may be, it makes a belief in God impossible. If this were not subversive enough, think about the rhetorical voice of the poet, a voice which takes on the mantle of the Lord and of the text of the books of Deuteronomy and Numbers, not to affirm the existence of God, but to affirm that something happened which made a belief in providence or God impossible. The third element in this message is that Auschwitz had replaced Jerusalem as a center of Jewish thinking. This in itself is a very disturbing statement. The Shema is the essential prayer of Judaism, and forgetting it is tantamount to dying as a Jew. Levi knew very well Psalm 137, verses 5 and 6, which gave an additional warning, as if one were not enough, of what he had in mind. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. This is where the anger comes from the Psalms. And the injunction right after the author's preface to remember Auschwitz carries within it the memory of the Exodus too. The plagues Levi envisages, the collapse of home, health, and family were precisely what he and millions of others who lived on planet Auschwitz knew in their bones. Forgetting meant betraying the dead, but remembering to him meant leaving behind any lingering or residual belief in God. His answer to the question of theodicy, if God is ubiquitous and all-powerful, how did evil get into the world, is clear. His answer is there is no God, no providence, no first cause, and hence no reason to say the Shema at all. If This Be a Man is a book in which Levi used the canonical Jewish prayer to subvert it. And I believe he had good reason to do so. Primo Levi came from a sophisticated, assimilated, middle-class Jewish family who had lived in Turin for generations. He was among those whom the Polish historian Isaac Deutscher termed non-Jewish Jews. That is, for many of those who benefited from the opening up of pathways to citizenship coming out of the French Revolution, Judaism was a matter of occasional practice, but not of belief. What would have been impossible for Protestants, for whom belief was essential, was endemic in Jewish intellectual and cultural life. There were Jewish agnostics and Jewish atheists from Spinoza's time to that of Franz Kafka and to our own day. I'm sure there are a number of Jewish atheists like me in the audience today. They were not believers, but they drew upon a rich tradition, which in Levi's case included a Jewish private language, a patois of Italian, Yiddish, and Hebrew, very useful in business or family transactions. I'll return to his marvelous book, The Periodic Table, his genealogical masterpiece, in which he describes with great affection the cultural rather than the liturgical meaning of his Jewishness. And like many of those caught in the Nazi racial trap, their Jewishness only appeared to matter fundamentally to them after they were persecuted. The great French historian Marc Bloch said famously that he never brought up his Jewishness except in the presence of an anti-Semite. Primo Levi's story was similar. though Bloch, a resistance figure captured, tortured, and shot, didn't live to tell the tale. There are two facets of the culture of assimilated Jews which were of distinct importance in the way Primo Levi framed his act of witnessing, and neither of them appears in the poetic foreword to If This Be a Man. That foreword is full of direct address and anger. Such rhetoric heightened our sense that Auschwitz was a strange, uncanny, unheimlich is Freud's sense of the term, and thoroughly brutalized world from which Levi only escaped by an accident of illness. It is such irony which made Primo Levi's voice in If This Be a Man a quintessentially Jewish voice for our times. The best guide to what I would like to term an ironic tradition framing an ironic Jewish discursive field that Levi inhabited is the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Yitzhak Bashevis Singer. He could no longer live within traditional Judaism in Poland, nor could he live in the Polish world on the other side of the synagogue wall, as it were, the secular world. Assimilated Jews all over Europe found themselves trapped between two impossible alternatives: going on with the old, which meant turning away from the Enlightenment, and escaping from a Jewish identity, a way that the Nazis closed off. It is this tension of impossible choices which produced both the irony and mordant comic vision of many other writers. Think for a moment of Kafka, drawn to Hasidism for inspiration and a kind of comedy and not for belief. Irony comes in many forms, but one of its incarnations is as the term we give to the cast of mind which has to negotiate a strange, violent, and insane world. Direct realism is not up to the task. The problem with irony, though, is that it always entails ambiguity, a built-in doubt about moral certainties, like a belief in God. Consider the ironic voice of the British soldier poets and novelists of the Great War. They were pacifists in uniform, trapped in a world with no exit, no escape, one overwhelmed by mass death. It was a narrative world in which the writer's freedom is less than ours. The literary critic Paul Fussell famously termed this style modern memory, the language of the soldier poets and later narrators of catastrophe in the 20th century. I believe Primo Levi was one of the masters of modern memory and its ironies. Let me return to the question as to why unvarnished realism is not adequate to the task of telling the story of the Shoah. If any event were surrealist, it is the Shoah. Extreme violence is hard to see and hard to portray. Besides, how can you portray or even imagine the deaths of over 1 million Jewish children? There has been since the 1930s a quarrel among commentators on the modern memory interpretation, which also applies to Levi's modern memory of the Shoah. The witness says, I am, I saw, and these things were. None of these statements can be ironic, since they form the core of an implicit social contract between the witness and his readers that he tells the truth and nothing but the truth. But the act of writing selects, condenses, and inevitably distorts. The ironist is fully aware of this predicament, as well as the difficulties emerging from the fragility of memory itself. Thus, when facing the task of describing mass death, the ironist chooses a language of indirection, of shifting perspectives, of asides and forms of direct address to the reader. And given these limitations and choices, almost always, the witness departs from the whole truth, which in the case of Primo Levi speaking about the Shoah, he believed was beyond us. Now, can there be any doubt that Primo Levi's fate was to live in this no man's land, this ironic space, both Jewish and devoid of Jewish belief, and then darkened by the shadows, both of those he termed the drowned and those he termed the saved. And yet his rich and complex Jewish identity contained all kinds of paradoxes evident well before anyone heard of the Nazis. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. I put this up even though it should be read in its own form. I'll just read a section of it because it's a description of language, of his approach to language. Its historical interest, the interest in this language, is slight, for it was never spoken by more than a few thousand people. Its human interest, however, is great, as is that of all languages on the border and of transition. Indeed, it has a wonderful comic power springing from the contrast between the Piedmontese dialect, the fabric of discourse, rugged, sober, and laconic, never written unless on a bet, and the Hebrew structure snatched away from the distant tongue of the fathers, sacred and solemn, geological, polished by the millennia like a glacial riverbed, and so on. I'll leave this, I think, for future reference for those who can return to this lecture. It is being recorded, and therefore you'll be able to read it in peace. And I think the extraordinary part of it is that it talks about the extent to which the Jewish people use a language while having an affectionate and dignified confidence in God, to which Primo Levi added a blasphemous and ironic voice. Now, central to that voice was his own gentle, yet powerful and piercing ironies. Shall we look at the next slide, please? Think about this as an ironic statement. It was my good fortune to be deported to Auschwitz only in 1944, that is, after the German government had decided, owing to the scarcity of labor, to lengthen the average lifespan of the prisoners destined for elimination. It was his good fortune, we're told. Irony in Greek means saying one thing and meaning another. Irony is a form of address to the reader separated from the narrative. Think about this remuneration. Can we see the next one? Man's capacity to dig himself in, to secrete a shell, to build around himself a tenuous barrier of defense, even in apparent desperate circumstances, is astonishing and merits a serious study. Then there is the statement just below it. Perhaps, are they not stories of a new Bible? Man's capacity then? I feel quite awkward, he wrote, towards my brain. I've not paid much attention to it, but it has served me well. And a more modern scale, I would not be accused of immodesty if I add that it was our idea, mine and Albert's, to steal. Next slide, please. To steal the roll of graph paper on which I wrote. You can almost hear his eyebrows going up as he wrote that phrase. Supercilious in the original meaning of the term, yet indeed. And given his doubts about the compatibility of the statement that Auschwitz happens and that God exists, what are we to make of the obiter dictum that I've already cited? Are these not stories of a new Bible, he asks mockingly, and then referring to the act of creation. To destroy a man is difficult, almost as difficult as to create one. Now, what Robert Gordon has termed rhetorical checks and balances, self-conscious interruptions, nods and winks to the reader, tend to stabilize Primo Levi, but disturb our balance, our understanding of at precisely what angle he is viewing the individual or the subject of his tale. But I depart from Gordon, who claims that irony demolishes the literary for the truthful. My view is that Levi demolishes the superficial and the literal, and then asks us to engage with him in accepting the puzzling and perhaps unfathomable nature of the truth he reveals. Levi was no postmodern ironist. To him, the truth exists. He knows it. He was an ironic moralist at sea in a tempest the world had never seen before, and after reading him, so are we all. The very worry Levi expressed in the prefatory poem I've cited before to If This Be a Man tells us much about the brilliantly unsettled and unsettling nature of his language. I use the word unsettled because on the one hand, his writing is a magnificent affirmation that Auschwitz did not, following Adorno, make either poetry or moral thinking impossible. Adorno's passage, by the way, was meant to get us to write poetry like philosophy anyway, even though it was more difficult than ever to do so. Primo Levi's voice is raised not only against the denier, but also against the immoral witness, the liar, the facile consoler, the individual who claimed to know what the Shoah was without having had direct knowledge of planet Auschwitz. The return of what he called and what we call the Holocaust denial in the 1980s both sickened and worried Levi, and this is well documented. It is definitely not my intention to enter the debate as to why Primo Levi committed suicide in 1987. He did suffer from depression, worried about his aged mother's infirmities and those of his mother-in-law. But older wounds healed, if at all, in his case, only partially. Telling the tale is not a curative matter. Perhaps it is sufficient to say that after 1943, The emotional ground under Levi's feet was always shifting. His irony was the voice of someone never able to stand on solid ground after the war. And yet, irony builds on irony. In that after the war period, and until the very day he died, he was almost always in the same place physically, in the house where he lived, that I tried to show you a moment or two ago. Virtually all of his life on a lovely avenue, not far from the rail terminal of Turin, his city surrounded by the majestic Italian Alps. Linda Hutchin, among others, points out that irony can create community. In this case, it is the community of survivors who knew in a visceral sense what Primo Levi knew. Reiterating that shared knowledge, and especially the ironies within it, can indeed bring some people closer together. The problem is with the rest of us. It is to us that the prefatory poem opening "If This Be a Man" is addressed. It is we who risk the curse Levi spat out, should we ignore, forget, or distort the devastating legacy of his imprisonment in Auschwitz. How painful was it for him to live in a sea of indifference or denial? Now, in my view, it is not at all clear whether telling the story of atrocities helps heal memories, wounds, or deepen them. Memory, as I said before, does not heal. It is neutral. It can open wounds as much as it can close them. Levi felt he had a story to tell, like Paul Celan, another Jewish poet and survivor of the Shoah in Romania. He also felt the profound vulnerability of the moral witness, whose tale was embedded inextricably in his life. Is that part of the story of Paul Celan's suicide in 1970 or Levi's in 1987? It's very difficult, even presumptuous to say. What we do know is that being a moral witness was both necessary for Primo Levi and at times unbearable. Here is Levi's rendering of the sense of having a task he could not deflect, and I quote, "During my imprisonment, despite the hunger, the cold, the blows, the fatigue, the gradual death of my companions, the promiscuity of all hours, I experienced an intense need to recount how much I was living. I knew that my hopes of being saved were minimal, but I also know that if I survived, I would have to tell the story. I would not be able to do less. To tell the story, to bear witness," that's his word, "was an end for which to save oneself, not to live and to tell, but to live in order to tell." That was his aim. Over time, he fulfilled his mission, not right away. If This Be a Man was rejected initially, published elsewhere, it initially vanished like a stone in water without a ripple. A decade later or more, the readership for his book was different, younger, more open to the telling of the story of Auschwitz. 20 years after it was written, in the 60s and 70s, the time of the Eichmann trial, the time of war crimes trials in Germany, the audience grew even greater. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, I want to compare something which, tell you about something which I've tried to do in many places. I've spoken about Primo Levi in many parts of the world. This is the 48th time that I've spoken about him. And in each time, in a university setting or thereabouts, I ask my host to check in the library whether I'm right. And the supposition that I put to my hosts, and that I still stand by, is that the library will have a copy of Anne Frank's diary, and it will have a copy of If This Be a Man. And in that library, there'll be a beautiful young girl's face on Anne Frank's book, and there'll be no face or hardly a face on Primo Levi's. I think in some ways, this goes back to the issue of the difficulty of telling uplifting stories about the Shoah. Of course, this takes nothing away from the beauty of Anne Frank's diary, however Baudelarized, to assert that though it was published in the same year as If This Be a Man in 1947, it was a story of the truncation of her life before she reached the camps. Anne Frank's diary is pre-Shoah. It's what happened before the worst. And it is that later story that Primo Levi turned into his masterpiece. Now, there are other differences too. Anne Frank's face is haunting, that of a thoughtful and vulnerable child. Primo Levi's photograph, as I said, is not on the jacket of any of the editions that I have. Maybe one of you has one that will enable me to correct this. I'd like to hear about it. I think what he wanted to do was to say that something happened in Auschwitz that made it difficult to see the human face again. He captured the strangeness of his life in the camps. In this sense, it went beyond Anne Frank's diary. It also went beyond the real to the serial strangeness of Auschwitz. In a celebrated moment early in If This Be a Man, Levi describes how he tried to assuage his raging thirst in the camp by breaking off an icicle outside the window, the broken window of his cell block. A patrolling guard snatched it away from him. Warum? I asked him in my poor German, Primo Levi says. Here is kein Warum. There is no why here, he replied, pushing me aside with a shove. A place that has no why is a place that challenges moral thinking on many levels. And it's the great achievement of Primo Levi to have placed that challenge in front of our eyes and to have shown how in a world with no humans in it, it is possible to be one, as the Pirkei Avot put it. He did it with ironic inflection, which suggests or brings us perhaps as close as possible to the affliction, the misery, the traumatic memory of the Shoah. Radical evil has a blinding light to it. And if we stare at it without mediation, we may not be able to see a thing. Using the lens of irony, Primo Levi refracted the destructive light of Auschwitz, thereby illuminating that dark world, that black hole in history we call the Shoah. Seeing it as a tangent, in the words of the poet Kafavi, may have been the only way for him, and it may be the only way for us to see this terrible time in history at all. Thank you very much.
All right. Profound. And I know you said this is the 48th talk that you've given on Primo Levi. Is the theme always the same?
No.
Or is this the first time you've given it in this way?
No. There are so many different facets to his life. The point is, I've never published this because there's so much more to say. It's something that I said to myself many years ago that I keep from my retirement. Now that I'm retired, I'm still not satisfied with it. I think it's a haunting admiration of the man that what I say is such a poor introduction to the words of one of the noblest figures in our universe. And it's to start people down the path of reading Primo Levi and thinking about him that I've spent the time and taken the occasions of invitations all over the world in the pre-COVID days, and maybe even in the post-COVID days, you never know, to return to this fundamental question about the complexity of his moral vision, which challenges notions of what it takes to tell the tale and what a price those who tell it pay.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating talk, and I can feel in the way that you give it, the sense in which you're still sort of working with the material and molding your thoughts about it. There are a number of very interesting comments in the chat as well, just at the very end there. And I know that we have some questions. So I'm going to start with Sammy's question. He wants to know, how does a moral witness heal from his firsthand of experience of horror? And I note that you spoke about remembering doesn't equate to healing. So I'm also curious to your thoughts on that question.
Well, I'd like to tell you a story which is not far from Yale at all. On one of the occasions when I was working on this, I used the archives, the wonderful Fortunoff Holocaust video archives in the university library. It's one of the great collections in the world, and we should be proud that Yale was the first university to sponsor an archive of this kind, and to the great, and alas, no longer with us, literary critic Jeffrey Hartman for having taken the initiative with others of the Yale community to make it happen. Joanne Rudolph and others who literally breathed life into this project. One, I was sitting looking at the screens, this is before the full digitization of their collection. I noticed across from me an oddity. The oddity was the face of the person that I was seeing on the screen was the same as the face of the person who was sitting on the other side of the table. And his name was Leon Wells. He was a man who had the terrible fate of becoming a Sonderkommando, a man who cleaned up the gas chambers and the ovens and so on after the killing. And he survived from the Janoschka camp, very close to one of the great centers of Jewish life in now Ukraine, Lvov, once called Lemberg. And when I saw that the man whose interview I was looking at was sitting across from me doing his own work, I asked him for a cup of coffee, and we went down the street on York Street, and I asked him, we exchanged pleasantries. I found out that he had a grandson who might have applied to Yale, and could I help him, and so on. It was a perfectly normal conversation. And I asked him, what is he doing? And he said he's writing a writing a book about the camp that he was in, that he knew, Janoschka, and to combat a number of stories that were told by people who had been there that couldn't possibly have been true. In other words, the moral witness versus the immoral witness. The immoral witness, in a way, from his viewpoint, sanitizes the story, makes it uplifting, if you will, protects a belief in God. There are Hasidic tales that come from the Janoschka camp as well. One of them drove him around the bend. It was a story of the Belzer Rebbe, one of the great leaders, who, according to the tale, was confronted by one of the Nazi sadists with a big hole in the camp, water filled, and said, if you jump over this and you make it to the other side, I'll leave you alive. If you don't and you fall in the middle, I'll kill you. And the Rebbe's followers say, we're not animals, we don't do tricks. But the Rebbe says, we don't choose the moment that we are going to die. So he left and he made it. And then his follower left and he made it. So the follower turns, according to the tale, to the Rebbe and says, Rebbe, how did you do it? And the Rebbe said, according to the tale, I grabbed the coattails of my ancestors. And the Rebbe asked his follower, how did you do it? And the follower said, I grabbed yours. This tale was something that Leon Wells found deeply disturbing. Who knows whether the truth is there or not? I'm not talking about it. It's speaking to the fundamental issue of the atheism of these two men, Primo Levi and Leon Wells, who both were moral witnesses. And they both believed that the story had to be told without any, shall we say, mitigating features. Now, to do that, to not go in the direction of what I would call mitigating features, is to risk one's mental health, one's mental order. And it's that which I would say healing is not something that moral witnesses can do. In fact, maybe they pay, that's the price that they pay. But it is something that we all need to know. Rarely happens anyway.
Okay, well said. There's a sort of a follow-on question from Evan Morris, who says, thank you for a wonderful presentation about my favorite author of all time. Is moral witness synonymous with prophet in the biblical sense, where the prophet is compelled to tell the ugly truth to a disbelieving public?
Mm-hmm. So far as I know, every single prophet believed in God. Primo Levi didn't. Can one be a prophet and an atheist? If so then who sends the prophet on the mission? And I think this is important because in the prophetic world, many of them didn't want to do it. In fact, they fled. In so many ways, it's not an easy task. Primo Levi couldn't flee. He lived to tell the tale. And I think that means that he wasn't a prophet. He didn't bring people back to righteousness. He didn't bring people back to the word of the Lord. In many ways, his life was lived without that word and yet with the language. Can you have the word and not the language? I wonder.
I'm going to go with, because you've brought up language, I'm going to go with a couple of questions that came in about in the chat. And I encourage you, if you could put your questions in the Q&A and not the chat, it makes it a little bit easier for me to make sure I've covered everyone's question best as I can. But we have a question from Michael about Primo Levi's ability to serve as a moral witness from a tactical standpoint. He entered Auschwitz as a trained chemist. How did he develop the skill to write so plainly, clearly, and horrifyingly, says Michael. And I pair that with a question from Susan, who wonders about the translators, that anyone could translate his work and express the irony in it so skillfully, and wonders how you view that.
Yes.
point.
Well, I can take the second one first. I know Stuart Wolf. This is an astonishing piece of work. It's quite amazing. And I think being English helped him because of the tradition of irony in 18th century prose and in the 20th century war poets. In my conversations with Stuart Wolf about the translation of Primo Levi in Florence, he was quite clear that there was something he felt very close between Primo Levi's irony and English usage. The other part of it is the richness of Primo Levi's Italian is something that, again, goes well beyond my capacity to comment on it. What he talks about, that's why I really, really enjoy and recommend everybody to read the periodic table. It is absolutely stunning and witty and filled with wisdom of all kinds. But it's the tale of a man who realizes that we learn language at our mother's knee. By that I mean family stories are filled with ironies. How would we live in our families if we didn't have an ironic sensibility? There's something about his tales in the periodic table which I think give an answer to Susan's question, which is a very deep one. And it does have to do, I think, with a certain multiplicity of identities that the Turin Jewish community had to negotiate at all times. And this happened, by the way, in different ways in many different places, like Czernowitz of Paul Celan, or if you will, it happened in Saloniki when it was 50% Jewish before the Second World War. The notion of not having one standpoint but multiple ones is built into Jewish life, and it still is there because now we have other viewpoints to negotiate. The Israeli viewpoint is one that comes into it, and it's one on which Primo Levi had some very deep thoughts. All I'm saying for a moment is that the skill of his writing is a function also of not following a chronological line. As he said, the chapters appear in If This Be a Man through their urgency and not through their sequence. And this to me is once again a very important ironic statement. That time doesn't go in straight lines, it leaps. And sometimes we find ourselves leaping forward and finding ourselves behind the time that we thought we were. This notion that something happened to him when he was in Auschwitz, which was beyond linear time, is what makes irony so wonderful and in so many respects, so powerful a vehicle to express doubt as well as certainty at one and the same time.
I'm stifling my own questions that I want to ask. There's
no.
really good.
Do make room for your questions too.
But, I think that's yeah, I know. I was reading yesterday about the popularity of trauma literature, psychiatric trauma literature at this point in our history currently now, and what you're saying about the nonlinear form of writing, that he wrote with the sense of urgency of the chapters and not with the linear nature in which the events happen. I think it speaks to the way that trauma is internalized by the observer. It's not internalized in a linear way, and it's not recorded in the body in a linear way. So I find there's a lot there that could be probed. I want to draw out your statement about irony, because Sammy raised the point of following on his question about the healing of the witness. Do you think that there's humor in the irony that could lighten the soul?
Yes, I wonder whether is it too late to just show that wonderful photograph of Primo Levi in 1970 when he was 51. Could we do that? Possibly, or is the PowerPoint gone? Because there's so much humor and what I would call wry wisdom in that face. That's the Primo Levi that I would like to talk to you, is the man in 1970. So if we can get back up on the PowerPoint, I'll be able to perhaps adumbrate. There he is. There's the smile and the glint in the eyes. There are also those wonderful eyebrows. Talk about the word supercilious, literally of adding emphasis. All the things that Zoom doesn't make as easy as it does in the classroom. The body language that, for 50 years of teaching, I was happy to use, very difficult to use in Zoom. Well, Primo Levi's body language is the answer. Yes, he had not only comedy, but also pathos. There's the whole range of emotions related to the absurdity of human life is part of the story. But there is also immense sadness. He spent a lot of time trying to help, talking about healing, trying to help the man who was named just among the nations, Lorenzo Perrone, who was a civilian bricklayer in Auschwitz, and who gave him gratuitously, just simply because he was a kind man, a smuggled soup ration every single day that probably kept Primo Levi alive. After the war, Perrone became an alcoholic and probably died of drink. Primo Levi tried to help him, to bring him around. He couldn't do it. In 1952, Perrone died, a man to whom perhaps he says his survival rests on his shoulders. Healing is not the word that I would use in this context.
There we go, sorry. Alan asked, isn't being a moral witness to Auschwitz like having a fatal disease? If you tell someone your disease, they may well pull back for fear of somehow being infected. They are other people, the saved, not the drowned.
That's a very difficult question, a good one. No, I don't think so. I don't think memory is a disease. I think it's an attribute of life. And therefore, when you say the moral witness is someone who carries a particular kind of memory, and it is a memory both of evil and of suffering. That's how Margalit describes it, and I think he's right. That particular standpoint is not catching. You can't get it when you're in the presence of someone who has it. What you might get is what I feel after my lifelong engagement at a distance with Primo Levi is immense respect and admiration for what he was able to do. If that were only catching, if we could say that the decency that Primo Levi embodied in his life was something we could all get a bit more of just by reading him, then I would be on the street corner now selling his books. Maybe that's what I'm doing in this speech. Maybe that's why I've given it so much thought and attention, but my God, it deserves it.
Well, let's see. I think that takes us to a question asked by Ruth and by Barry. Barry wanted to know, had he received psychiatric care? Had he done psychoanalysis? And Ruth wanted to know, having lived so long with the trauma and the memories, why do you think he eventually took his own life? Suicide wasn't unusual amongst various kinds of survivors, but often sooner after the experience is when it would have occurred.
There are two things to say in answer to the second question. One is, and I'm not a professional gerontologist nor a psychiatrist at all. I'm an historian. But what I've seen in my own life is that when people stop working, sometimes the underlying depression comes out. When they don't have the same 9-to-5 jobs, or the Yale students coming to lectures, or the responsibilities of raising children who go and fly the coop. When you basically have your own thoughts as your primary companions, some of the darkness can come back and be overwhelming. And I believe, again, the professionals can speak of that in a way I can't. On the issue, as I said, I don't want to weigh in on the question of suicide, but what I would like to say is that there are those who think it was an accident. Of course, he was medically treated. There were all kinds of ways of treating depression at the time, as there is today. But there are those whom I respect, who believe he fell off, he lost his balance and fell into an inner courtyard from the third floor, and that's what did it. Others say, he lived there all his life. How could that be? I would prefer to retain a dignified silence on this and say that if he did take his own life, then his reasons were ones that he kept to himself, because he spoke to one of his friends who was a rabbi in Rome 10 minutes before, and he said nothing about it. If that is the case, then that's probably the right way to go.
Yeah, I note Sergio's comment that many question whether or not it was a suicide, and Sergio's opinion that as a chemist, he could find a better way to die than to come from the stairs.
Yes, he could. He could. There is something else to add to that, which is worrying. I remember in 1987, after his death was announced, that there was a degree of disappointment in the obituaries that followed, that we needed him to stay alive. How could he do this? And I think an astonishing, well, I'll put it this way, the humanity of the man is so overwhelming that the answer is clear. He suffered from what Elie Wiesel said, that he died in Auschwitz 40 years later. He suffered from what he brought with him every day of his life. What made it possible to survive seems to me to be an even better question than what broke him at the end, if that is indeed what happened.
Very interesting point. I want to switch over to a question, that burning question Lawrence has put in the Q&A box. Could you say something about the Canto of Ulysses?
Oh, the business of retaining in the minds of people doing the work of, what shall we call it, of Untermenschen, the business of retaining Dante or any other classical poet is one of those moments in Primo Levi's writings which do indicate I'll say this, with deep respect, the Italian nature of the story. There is a whole Italian side to this, that of course, Dante's Inferno would come to an Italian. It would come to many other people too. It wouldn't necessarily have to do it, but the cadences, the beauty of the Italian language, the strength that it must have taken to say that that world of human values is the world I still inhabit. That's what that section of Levi's book says to me. It's what can't be destroyed in a human being that still brings tears to my eyes when I read If This Be a Man. There are parts of it that are simply stop me in my tracks, and that is one of them.
Well, I hope eventually you do decide to write on this, Professor Winter, because your words about the story are so eloquent and thought-provoking. You mentioned Levi as an Italian and the sensibilities that he would bring to his point of view as an Italian. And someone has asked, was irony a particular characteristic of the Italian Jews' depiction of the Holocaust? I think of the movie Life is Beautiful.
Yes. Well, Life is Beautiful is a fable. It's a children's tale. And actually the director says it right at the beginning, that this is not a realistic story. This is a story for children. And to a degree, this is not at all in the universe that Primo Levi was talking about, because he didn't want to sugarcoat the story. And at the end, when the tank comes around the corner, the American tanks comes, and the little boy realizes that they won the game, even though his father wasn't with him, and walking in the streets of Italy and just coming across his mother. These are moments of beauty and of solace. Perhaps one reason why I've never published on Primo Levi is that I don't feel that solace. I feel the beauty, but not the solace. I'm still engaged with Primo Levi as one of the great moral philosophers of our time. And it is my feeling of modesty in his presence that I think has prevented me from publishing it.
Okay, we have a few more minutes left and we have a few more questions left. And thank you to everyone for the time, giving us the time and bringing these really fascinating questions to the table. Federico asks a question about moral witness. Does the moral witness need to declare a thoughtful argument with a global objective? Is the public declaration of someone like Dr. Christine Blasey Ford against Judge Kavanaugh an example?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, that in some ways that encounter in the confirmation hearings of a Supreme Court judge took great courage. Whatever the truth, and again, memory is frail. Whatever the truth, speaking out in the way that she did took courage. And it is a sense that there is a responsibility that those who have suffered speak about it, so that the next generation of those confronting similar abuse can warn the abuser that they will be heard. The person damaged will not be silent or silenced. I think this is important. Primo Levi was certainly someone who doesn't need me to speak for him. His voice is so powerful. But the sense in which speaking out has a price attached to it is something we really have to think about. It really does matter. There's one famous occasion in the Eichmann trial where a particular survivor who was called Kachetnik, which means concentration camp inmate, started to say, I didn't live in this world or this universe. I lived somewhere else called Planet Auschwitz, and then he collapsed. in the Eichmann trial. It's a complicated story, but the essence of it is one that I think we should realize. Admiring people who speak out doesn't necessarily make us less understanding of the people who don't. We hope that they can take the risk, but it's not for us to say that they have to. They have to feel it from within, the way Primo Levi did. And if they don't, I'm afraid we have to accept silence as one of the fundamental languages of memory. It's what people most of the time do. Most of the time, people don't speak out about evil and injustice. Are they right to be frightened? Yes. Are they right to be silent? I don't know.
Okay, I think we have one last question that is quite profound, and I think a good note to wrap up on. Is the pain of absence of adequate language making complete moral witnessing impossible? Perhaps the reason for the suicides, not only of Primo Levi, but of Paul Celan, as you mentioned, and Jerry Kosinski, among others who survived the Shoah. Another Jewish irony in this writing is the basic Jewish prayer, God open my lips so I may sing your praise. Moral witness is a prayer aiming at the truth, now replacing the praise of God, but a prayer nevertheless. And I'm sorry, the person who asked this really thoughtful question did not share their name.
Well, whoever you are, thank you for it. I think the important point to make there is that an atheist can pray too, but to what and to whom? I leave the question open because I think it's deeply personal. What is clear is that the language of the Bible exists and has force independent of the theology of the Bible. Throughout most of the 5 books of Moses, words appear before actions. Words appear before events. Words matter. Words are very important. Beliefs are too. But perhaps the very fact that Primo Levi was prepared to write may help us appreciate the genius of his achievement. I would also like to simply add the fact that it would be marvelous for someone else to speak about the other ways in which survivors spoke through art. There are many people who know this field better than I. The written world is only one, and the Shoah existed beyond words, but it existed in many other forms. And among them, I think, are the visual arts. It would be very good to learn more from someone who is equipped to do so. What I've done is very limited, but I hope the beginning of the interest of some of you in following it up further.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Winter. This has been such an intriguing conversation. I think I speak for many of us when I say definitely worth rewatching. And so I'm very grateful that we have the recording, and we will be posting it on the Yale Alumni Academy website so that everyone can watch it again, because these are questions that we could spend a lifetime pondering. And also feel free to share with others that you think might be interested in seeing the recording. We will send an email out to everyone with a link. Do you have any final comments as we close, Professor Winter?
No, just to thank you for giving me the privilege of being able to speak about one of the great men of the century, one of the great men of the 20th century and more than the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank all of you all for attending. We hope to see you on the next Yale Alumni Academy presentation. And until then, visit us on our website, yalealumniacademy.yale.edu.